The silent cowboy. The desert wind carried whispers of cruelty that morning, though Silent Jake Morrison couldn't have known it as he rode through the canyon pass. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Courage, picked her way carefully down the rocky slope, while Jake scanned the horizon with eyes that had seen too much violence in his 32 years. Jake hadn't spoken a word to another human being in 3 years. Not since the day he'd buried his wife and infant daughter after the fever took them. The silence had become his companion, as faithful as Courage beneath him. He communicated through nods, gestures, and the occasional grunt, when absolutely necessary. Most folks in the scattered settlements had learned to read his meaning well enough. The sun was climbing toward its merciless noon position when Jake spotted something that made him rein in hard. There, silhouetted against a weathered wooden cross, planted in the hardpan, was the unmistakable shape of a person. As he rode closer, his blood turned to ice water in his veins. A girl, couldn't be more than 16 or 17, hung bound to the cross by thick rope. Her long brown hair hung in tangled curtains around her face, and her simple cotton dress was torn and stained with dust and dried tears. She wasn't moving. Jake spurred Courage forward and leaped down before the horse had fully stopped. He pulled his knife and began sawing through the ropes, his weathered hands working with practiced efficiency. The girl's head lolled forward as the bonds came free, and Jake caught her slight weight against his chest. She was alive. He could feel the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst, and red welts marked her wrists where the ropes had bitten deep. Jake carried her to the shade of a scraggly mesquite and laid her down gently, then fetched his water canteen. "Easy now," he whispered, the first words he'd spoken aloud in months. His voice came out as a rav. He dripped water onto her lips and watched her tongue dart out instinctively to catch the moisture. Her eyes fluttered open, deep brown like coffee beans, but filled with such fear and pain that Jake had to look away for a moment. When he looked back, she was staring at him with the wariness of a wounded animal. "Won't hurt you," Jake said softly, offering her another sip of water. "Safe now." The girl tried to speak but only managed to croak. Jake waited patiently while she drank, his eyes sweeping the surrounding desert for any sign of whoever had done this to her. When she could finally speak, her voice was barely a whisper. "Papa said I had to marry Mr. Grimsby," she managed. "I said no. He said if I wouldn't marry him I could marry the desert instead." Jake's jaw tightened. He knew Grimsby, a fat, cruel man who owned a saloon in Silver Creek and had already buried 2 wives under suspicious circumstances. The thought of this girl being forced into such a union made something dark and cold settle in Jake's chest. "Your papa did this?" Jake asked, though the answer was written in the despair on her face. She nodded, fresh tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "He said I was stubborn like my mama, and look what it got her. Said the desert would teach me obedience or kill me trying." Jake studied her face, seeing the resemblance now to Mary Blackwood, a woman who'd been found dead at the bottom of a cliff 5 years back. Everyone said it was an accident, but Jake had always wondered. Samuel Blackwood was known for his temper and his heavy hand with both animals and family. "What's your name?" Jake asked. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Blackwood." Jake nodded grimly. He'd heard Samuel Blackwood had a daughter, but the man kept her locked away on his remote ranch like she was something to be ashamed of. Now Jake understood why. "Can you ride?" he asked. Sarah struggled to sit up, wincing as movement sent pain through her cramped muscles. "I think so." Where are you taking me?" Jake considered this. He couldn't take her back to her father. That much was certain. Silver Creek had no law worth speaking of, and Judge Morrison, no relation despite the name, was in Grimsby's pocket. The nearest real lawman was in Tucson, 3 days hard ride away. "My place," Jake said finally. "Get you fed, healed up, then we figure what comes next." Sarah's eyes widened with fear. I can't. I won't be anybody's. I mean, if you think I'm going to. Jake held up a hand to stop her. He understood her fear. She'd been betrayed by the one man who should have protected her above all others. Trust would not come easily. You're safe, he said simply. Give you my word. Something in his tone, or maybe in his steady grey eyes, seemed to reassure her. She nodded slowly, and Jake helped her to her feet. She swayed dangerously, and he steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. Jake's ranch was modest. A small adobe house, a barn, a corral, and enough land to graze his small herd of cattle. It sat in a hidden valley, where a year-round spring provided precious water. He'd chosen the location specifically for its isolation after losing his family, wanting to be left alone with his grief. As they rode through the canyon that led to his valley, Sarah spoke for the first time since leaving the cross behind. Why don't you talk much? She asked. Jake was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, "Lost my family. Fever." Seemed like words died with them. "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. Jake just nodded, not trusting himself to speak about it further. The house was spartanly furnished but clean. Jake had kept it exactly as his wife Emma had left it, down to the blue-checked curtains in the kitchen windows and the sampler on the wall that read, "Bless this home." He showed Sarah to the spare room, what would have been the nursery if little Mary had lived to use it. "Rest," he told her. "I'll fix some food." Jake was no great cook, but he could manage beans and bacon and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. While Sarah slept, he sat on his porch and pondered the situation. He couldn't keep the girl here indefinitely. Folks would talk, and it wouldn't be fair to her. But he couldn't send her back to Samuel Blackwood either. The answer came to him as he watched the sun set behind the canyon walls. His sister Ruth lived in California with her husband on a successful ranch. They'd been trying to have children for years without success. Ruth had always been kind-hearted, and her husband Tom was a good man. They could give Sarah the family she deserved. But first, there was the matter of Samuel Blackwood. Sarah slept for 16 hours straight, her body finally able to rest without fear. When she woke, Jake had hot food waiting and clean clothes that had belonged to Emma. They were a bit big, but Sarah didn't mind. It felt good to be clean again. Over the next few days, Sarah slowly began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. Jake never pressed her to talk, but gradually she began sharing pieces of her story. Her mother had died when Sarah was 11, and Samuel had grown increasingly bitter and controlling afterward. He'd forbidden her to attend school, to have friends, to leave the ranch except for church on Sunday. He said I was all he had left of Mama, Sarah said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. But then he started talking about me marrying Mr. Grimsby, saying it would be good for business. When I refused, he got angry, said I was ungrateful, that I owed him obedience. Jake listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding. His silence was somehow more comforting than empty reassurances would have been. "What happened to your family?" Sarah asked one night. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkness beyond the porch light. Finally, he began to speak in his quiet, measured way. "Emma was the prettiest girl in 3 counties, he said. Smart too. Don't know why she picked me, but she did. We were happy, real happy. When she got pregnant, I thought I'd bust from pride, built that cradle in there with my own hands." He paused, his voice growing rough. "Baby Mary was born in spring. Perfect little thing. Then the fever came through in fall. Took half the town. Took them both in 3 days. Emma first, then the baby. I buried them up on the hill behind the house." Sarah reached over and touched his hand gently. "I'm sorry," she said. Jake nodded. After that, words just seemed useless. What was the point of talking when the only people I wanted to talk to were gone? They sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 wounded souls finding unexpected solace in each other's company. On the 4th day, Jake rode into Silver Creek alone. leaving Sarah safely hidden at the ranch. He had business to conduct, and some of it might turn ugly. His first stop was the saloon where Grimsby held court. The fat man was in his usual spot at a corner table, counting money and leering at the serving girls. Jake walked up to him and set a folded paper on the table. Grimsby looked up with annoyance. "What's this?" Jake pointed to the paper. Grimsby unfolded it and found a short message written in Jake's careful script. "The girl is under my protection. Leave her be." Grimsby's face darkened. "That little bitch belongs to me. Samuel promised her to me, and I paid good money for the privilege." Jake's expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous flickered in his grey eyes. He placed his hand on the butt of his Colt-built .45. Grimsby swallowed nervously. Silent Jake Morrison might not talk much, but he had a reputation for being fast on the draw and accurate with his shots. "Now see here, Morrison, this is a business arrangement. You can't just—" Jake leaned forward and spoke in a voice so quiet only Grimsby could hear. "Touch her and I'll kill you." The simple, matter-of-fact way he said it left no doubt he meant every word. Grimsby paled and nodded quickly. Jake's second stop was Samuel Blackwood's ranch. He found the man in his barn tending to a lame horse. Blackwood looked up as Jake approached, his face showing surprise and then guilt. "Morrison," Blackwood said nervously, "what brings you out here?" Jake pulled out another piece of paper and handed it over. This one read, "Found your daughter. You're done being her father." Blackwood's face flushed red with anger. "You got no right. She's my property, my responsibility. I was teaching her a lesson about obedience." Jake's hand moved to his gun, and Blackwood stumbled backward. "You left her to die," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. "Any man who'd do that to his own child ain't fit to call himself a father. She's stubborn just like her mother was." Blackwood protested. "Needed to learn her place." "Her place ain't tied to a cross in the desert," Jake replied. He pulled out a third piece of paper, a legal document he'd had drawn up in town. "This says you're giving up all parental rights. Sign it." "I won't sign nothing. She belongs to me." Jake drew his gun in one smooth motion, pointing it directly at Blackwood's chest. "Sign it, or I'll leave you tied to that same cross." Blackwood's bluster crumbled. With shaking hands, he signed the document, officially severing all legal ties to Sarah. Jake holstered his gun and turned to leave, then paused. "If I see you anywhere near her again, I'll finish what the desert started." Back at the ranch, Jake found Sarah helping with the evening chores. She'd taken to ranch life naturally, and he'd caught himself thinking how Emma would have liked her. She was nothing like his wife in appearance. Emma had been blonde and blue-eyed where Sarah was dark, but she had the same gentle spirit and quiet strength. "Where did you go?" Sarah asked as he unsaddled. "Courage. Took care of some things," Jake said. He handed her the legal papers. "You're free now, officially." Sarah read through the documents with growing amazement. "He actually signed this." "Didn't have much choice," Jake said dryly. That night over dinner, Jake told Sarah about his plan to send her to California to live with his sister Ruth. "She's good people," he explained. "Her and Tom have a big ranch, nice house. They'd treat you like their own daughter." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, pushing beans around on her plate. "What if I don't want to go to California?" she asked finally. Jake looked up, surprised. "Why wouldn't you? Better life there, more opportunities." "What if I want to stay here?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake set down his fork and studied her face. "Sarah, you're 16 years old. You got your whole life ahead of you. Shouldn't spend it stuck out here with an old hermit." "You're not old," Sarah said, "and you're not a hermit anymore. You talk to me." Jake felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart after losing Emma and Mary. "That's different," he said roughly. How Jake struggled to find words. How could he explain that talking to her felt natural in a way that talking to others didn't? That her presence in his house had chased away some of the loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 years. "Just is," he said finally. Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand. "You saved my life," she said softly. "Not just from the desert, but from him, from all of it. You gave me back my voice, my choice. I'm choosing to stay. People will talk, Jake warned. Say things that ain't true. Let them talk, Sarah said with surprising firmness. I know the truth. And so do you. Over the following weeks, they settled into a comfortable routine. Sarah proved to have a natural way with the cattle and horses, and she slowly began to bring life back to the ranch. She planted a vegetable garden, hung new curtains, and filled the house with the sound of humming and occasional laughter. Jake found himself talking more and, at first just practical things about the ranch work, but gradually more personal conversations. Sarah told him about her dreams of maybe being a teacher someday, and Jake found himself sharing memories of Emma and baby Mary that he'd kept locked away for years. You still love her, Sarah observed one evening, as Jake finished a story about Emma's cooking disasters. Always will, Jake said simply. Good, Sarah said, surprising him. Love like that doesn't die just because the person does. It becomes part of who you are. Jake looked at her with new respect. For all her youth, Sarah had an old soul and a wisdom born of suffering. She understood loss in a way most people her age never would. One morning in late summer, Jake woke to find Sarah already up and cooking breakfast. She was humming an old hymn, and the sound made something warm settle in his chest. This was what a home was supposed to sound like. Morning, he said, accepting a cup of coffee from her. Morning, she replied with a smile. I was thinking, maybe we should ride into town today. I need some fabric to make new curtains for the front room. Jake frowned. Don't need new curtains. The ones in there are starting to fade, Sarah said gently. And they're sad curtains. This house needs happy curtains. Jake started to argue, then stopped. The blue-checked curtains had been Emma's favorite, but keeping everything exactly as she'd left it wasn't honoring her memory. It was imprisoning it. Emma had loved change, loved making things beautiful and bright. All right, he said finally, we'll go to town. Silver Creek was buzzing with activity when they arrived. News of Sarah's rescue had spread, though the details had been embellished in the telling. Some folks whispered that Jake had killed Samuel Blackwood. He hadn't. The man had simply left town after signing the papers. Others claimed Sarah was Jake's secret daughter, or his young bride. Jake ignored the stares and whispers, but Sarah held her head high and met every curious gaze directly. She was no longer the frightened, broken girl he'd found tied to that cross. She'd found her strength, her voice. At the general store, Mrs. Patterson, the store owner's wife, gave them a disapproving look. Mighty young to be keeping house, she said pointedly to Sarah. Old enough to choose my own life, Sarah replied calmly, selecting yellow fabric with tiny white flowers. Mrs. Patterson sniffed. Decent young ladies don't live alone with men they're not married to. Decent young ladies don't get tied to crosses by their fathers either, Sarah said with steel in her voice. But here we are. Mrs. Patterson's mouth opened and closed like a fish, and Jake had to hide a smile. Sarah had definitely found her voice. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Sheriff Coleman approached. Jake tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Easy, Morrison, Coleman said, raising his hands. Just wanted to thank you. Jake raised an eyebrow. Samuel Blackwood was trouble, Coleman explained. Had complaints about him for years, but never could prove anything. What you did, well, let's just say some problems solved themselves. Jake nodded curtly and helped Sarah into the wagon. On the ride home, Sarah was unusually quiet. Finally, Jake asked what was troubling her. Do you think they're right? She asked. About it not being proper for me to live with you. Jake considered the question carefully. Don't much care what other people think, he said finally. But I care what you think. If you're uncomfortable, I'm not, Sarah said quickly. It's just, I know people are talking, saying things about you, about us. I don't want to hurt your reputation. Jake actually laughed. A short, rusty sound. Darlin', I'm a hermit who hasn't spoken to most folks in 3 years. Don't think I got much of a reputation left to hurt. Sarah smiled at the endearment. It was the first time he'd called her anything other than her name. Besides, Jake continued, anyone who's got a problem with how we live can take it up with my cult. That autumn, Jake received a letter from his sister Ruth in California. She'd heard about Sarah through mutual acquaintances and was curious about the girl who'd brought her brother back to the land of the living. "She sounds wonderful," Ruth wrote. "Tom and I would still be honored to have her if she changes her mind about coming west. But Jake, if she's helping you heal, maybe that's where she needs to be. Maybe it's where you both need to be." Jake read the letter twice, then handed it to Sarah. She read it thoughtfully, then looked up at him. "Your sister sounds nice," she said. "She is," Jake agreed. "But I still don't want to go to California." "Why?" Jake asked, though he thought he knew the answer. Sarah was quiet for a moment, gathering her thought. "Because this is home," she said finally. "Your home. I know it's not conventional, but when has my life ever been conventional? You gave me a choice when no one else would. You gave me a voice when everyone else wanted to silence me. You gave me a family when my own father threw me away." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Sarah, I know you loved Emma," she continued. "I know you still do. I'm not trying to replace her or compete with her memory. But I love you too, Jake. Not like a father. I know what fathers are supposed to be like, and what I feel for you isn't that. And maybe not like Emma did, but in my own way. You're the first person who ever made me feel safe, who ever made me feel valued for who I am, instead of what I could do for them." Jake stared at her, his weathered face reflecting a dozen different emotions. "You're 17 years old," he said hoarsely. "I'll be 18 in 2 months," Sarah replied. "And I've lived through more in 17 years than most people do in a lifetime. I know my own mind, Jake. People will say I took advantage of you, that I groomed you or manipulated you. Let them say it," Sarah said firmly. "We know the truth. You saved my life and asked for nothing in return. You've never once made me feel uncomfortable or pressured. Every choice I've made since you found me has been freely made." Jake stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window, staring out at the valley that had been his refuge for so long. Sarah watched him, her heart in her throat. "I'm too old for you," he said finally. "You're 32, Sarah replied. "Emma was 19 when you married her. That's only 2 years older than I am now." Jake turned back to face her. "This is different." "How?" "Because," Jake struggled for words, "because I already buried one family. Don't think I could survive losing another one." Sarah stood up and walked to him, placing her small hands on his chest. "Life doesn't come with guarantees, Jake. Emma and baby Mary dying wasn't your fault. And it doesn't mean you don't deserve to be happy again. It doesn't mean we don't deserve to be happy again." "I've been sure since the first night I slept safely in your house," Sarah said. "I've been sure since the first time you made me laugh. I've been sure since I realized that home isn't a place. It's a person. And you're my person, Jake Morris." He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious that might break. When they separated, Sarah smiled up at him. "Was that so hard?" she teased. Jake actually smiled back. A real smile, the first she'd seen from him. "Reckon not," he said. They were married 2 months later on Sarah's 18th birthday, by the circuit preacher, who came through Silver Creek once a month. Ruth and Tom made the trip from California to attend, and Jake found he liked his new brother-in-law immensely. Ruth took one look at how Jake and Sarah interacted, and declared herself completely satisfied with the arrangement. "I haven't seen you smile this much since before Emma died," she told Jake privately. "Sarah's good for you. She saved my life," Jake replied simply. "Sounds like you saved each other." The wedding was small, just Ruth and Tom, Sheriff Coleman, and his wife, and Mrs. Henderson from the church. Sarah wore Emma's wedding dress, which she'd altered to fit, with Jake's blessing. It felt right somehow, like Emma was giving her approval to this new chapter. As they stood before the preacher, Jake thought about the twist of fate that had led him to that cross in the desert. If he'd ridden a different route that day, if he'd been an hour later or earlier, Sarah would have died and he would have remained lost in his grief and silence. Instead, they'd found each other, 2 broken souls who'd somehow managed to heal each other's wounds. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Jake kissed his bride as the small gathering applauded. Sarah's eyes were bright with tears of joy, and Jake realized that for the first time in 3 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. That night, as they lay in bed in the room that had once been his and Emma's, Sarah traced patterns on Jake's chest with her finger. "Do you think she would approve?" Sarah asked softly. "Emma, I mean." Jake was quiet for a moment, considering. "Emma always said life was for living," he said finally. "Said if anything ever happened to her, she didn't want me to spend the rest of my life mourning. She'd want me to be happy." "Good," Sarah said, settling more comfortably against his side. "Because I plan to make you very happy, Jake Morrison." "Already do," Jake murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. 5 years later, Jake stood on the same porch where he'd once sat in lonely silence, watching his wife hang laundry on the line. Sarah's belly was round with their second child, a boy, if the old wives' tales were to be believed. Their daughter Emma, named for Jake's first wife, toddled around the yard chasing chickens and filling the air with her laughter. Sarah looked up and caught him watching her, giving him that smile that still made his heart skip after all these years. "What are you thinking about?" she called. "Just grateful," Jake called back, his voice strong and sure now. "Grateful for everything." Sarah finished hanging the last sheet and walked over to him, standing between his knees as he sat on the porch step. She was dusty and disheveled from her work, her hair escaping its braid, but she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "I love you," she said, leaning down to kiss him. "Love you too," Jake replied, the words coming easily now, more than words can say. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He'd lost everything once, thought his story was over. Then a girl tied to a cross had changed everything, bringing him back to life with her courage and determination and love. Some folks in town still whispered about their unconventional beginning, but Jake didn't care. He'd learned that love came in many forms, that healing was possible even from the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the best families were the ones you chose rather than the ones you were born into. The girl who'd been left to die in the desert had not only survived but thrived, growing into a strong woman who ran their ranch with competence and grace. And the silent cowboy who'd found her had rediscovered his voice, his purpose, and his capacity for joy. Together they'd built something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. A love story written in the red dirt of the desert, sealed with trust and strengthened by the knowledge that they'd both chosen each other freely and completely. As little Emma toddled over to him with a wild flower clutched in her chubby fist, Jake scooped her up and settled her on his lap. This was what happiness looked like, messy and imperfect and more precious than gold. The silent cowboy was silent no more, and the girl who'd been left to die had instead learned to truly live. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all.